My name is Jenna Parker, and a few hours before my world flipped upside down, I still believed my parents' little house in Phoenix was waiting for me, exactly where I'd left it. 6 months away, one suitcase in my hand, and I walked into my sister's high-rise apartment expecting an awkward catch-up, maybe a guilty hug. Nothing more. Instead, she leaned back against her marble kitchen island, swirling a glass of wine like she was celebrating a promotion. Her lips curled into this satisfied little half-smile as she told me, almost casually, that the house I grew up in had sold for $600,000 while I was gone. For a second, my brain refused to process the words. That house wasn't an asset to offload. It was my inheritance, my anchor, the one thing I thought was safe. My chest went tight, my ears rang, and all I could get out was a hoarse, "How could you do that without even asking me?" The answer wasn't an apology. It wasn't even an explanation. It was the sharp sting of her hand across my face and the hard shove that sent me stumbling toward the hallway. I remember the door slamming, her voice spitting one last insult through the wood, telling me to get out like I was some stranger who'd wandered into the wrong life. I walked away shaking, my cheek burning, my mind trying to decide what hurt more, losing the house or realizing exactly what my own sister thought I was worth. What I did next, and who showed up at her door the very next morning, made sure she would never forget that moment. Before I tell you what he said, and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. A quieter thought surfaced as I tried to steady myself, and it pulled me back to the years when everything in my family felt intact. I grew up in a modest house on the west side of Phoenix, a place my parents treated less like property and more like an inheritance of values. They poured their weekends into repairing the roof, planting desert shrubs, or refinishing the cabinets, always telling me that a home carried the weight of the people who lived inside it. I absorbed every bit of that belief without realizing how rare it was to hold on to something so consistently. My older sister, Lydia Parker, never connected with the house in the same way. She was the type who needed noise, movement, and newness. While I stayed close to my parents, she drifted toward anything that promised excitement or the illusion of success. As kids, we were different in ways that didn't matter yet, differences that grew sharper as we aged. I became the one who spent Saturday mornings helping Mom repaint a wall, while Lydia rushed out to meet friends before breakfast was even cleared from the table. When our parents passed away, their will reflected a truth none of us said aloud. I had been the one holding the house together with them. Lydia received money they had saved specifically for her, which she accepted with the same bright enthusiasm she brought to most things. I received the house, and although it was the more sentimental asset, it came with responsibilities I didn't resent. I saw it the way my parents had taught me to, something to maintain and protect, not liquidate for convenience. For a while, managing the house grounded me. I worked long shifts, but coming home to a space shaped by my family gave me clarity. Phoenix could be relentless with its heat and noise, yet inside those walls I felt a kind of calm I didn't find anywhere else. Lydia, meanwhile, kept bouncing between jobs she couldn't stand and goals that shifted every few months. Whenever she visited, she complained about the creaking floors or outdated fixtures, insisting I should upgrade everything or just sell it and start fresh. I always brushed those comments aside, not realizing how deeply they hinted at something unsettled inside her. Months before I left for Seattle, my supervisor offered me a temporary assignment that would advance my career if I accepted. I hesitated. The timing felt wrong, and the thought of leaving the house for half a year made me uneasy. But Mom's voice stayed with me, her belief that stepping forward never meant abandoning where you came from. I eventually agreed, telling myself that the house would be fine with the precautions I planned to take. Preparing for that trip consumed several weeks. I arranged for the utilities to continue automatically, installed updated security cameras that stored everything in a cloud account only I could access, and locked away documents in a cabinet that hadn't been opened since our parents' final year. I even walked through each room before leaving, making sure lights were off, blinds closed, and everything sat exactly as I wanted to find it again. The one thing I didn't question was the spare key Lydia still had from years earlier. She'd used it occasionally to drop something off or check on the house when I worked long shifts. I told myself it wasn't an issue. I chose to believe she saw the house as I did, as something worth preserving, even if she didn't always understand why I held it so tightly. It never crossed my mind that familiarity with those keys or with pieces of my personal information could be misused. Trust tends to blind you in small, quiet ways long before you notice anything is off. In the final week before my departure, Lydia showed up unannounced. She claimed she wanted to clear the air, though nothing had been particularly tense between us. She wandered through the house slowly, running her hand along the banister, looking at the ceiling as if checking for cracks. When she asked again why I insisted on keeping a place that barely reflected who I was becoming, I laughed it off, assuming she was joking. I didn't realize she was studying the space with a different intention, one she never shared, and one I didn't imagine even in my worst guesses. Once I arrived in Seattle, my days filled quickly. I adapted to the cooler air, the unfamiliar pace, and the responsibility of a new role. I thought about the house often, but always with comfort, never suspicion. Every so often, I opened the camera app to glance at the entryway or living room. The still frames were ordinary. No movement, nothing out of place, nothing to warn me about the months ahead. Looking back now, what unsettles me most isn't the deception itself, but how naturally I trusted the people closest to me. I believed stability inside a family was something permanent, not something that could be rearranged quietly behind closed doors. The distance between Phoenix and Seattle gave Lydia room to make choices I would have never predicted. Choices that unraveled everything I assumed was safe. When my assignment eventually neared its end, I imagined returning to the same house I had left, the one shaped by my parents' hands, preserved by my routines, and protected by the systems I had put in place. I had no reason to expect otherwise. The idea that anything had changed never even entered my mind. A steady breath helped clear my thoughts as I turned onto my street, expecting the familiar quiet of the neighborhood I had missed for months. The Arizona sun pressed down on the pavement, and for a moment I imagined stepping into my house exactly as I had left it, dusty from disuse, but untouched, waiting. That hope carried me until I reached the driveway and noticed changes that didn't belong to me. The shrubs had been trimmed differently, the porch light had been replaced, and a new welcome mat sat where my old one should have been. It was subtle, but nothing subtle ever happened on that property unless I arranged it myself. I pulled my suitcase closer, trying to reason through what I was seeing. Maybe someone I knew had stopped by to help with upkeep. Maybe a neighbor had stepped in, though none of them would have dared cross boundaries without telling me first. The sensation growing in my chest told me something was off long before I knocked on the front door. It opened before I even touched it. A woman I had never seen stood inside the frame, holding a toddler on her hip. Behind her, the living room was filled with furniture that didn't belong to my family. Bright toys scattered across the floor, a couch pushed against the wall where my parents used to hang framed photographs, and a bookshelf packed with children's books sat beside a TV I didn't recognize. For a second, my body refused to move. I must have looked like someone who had taken a wrong turn and wandered into a stranger's home, even though every nail, every tile, every corner belonged to the childhood version of myself. The woman gave me a polite, confused smile, the kind people reserve for unexpected visitors who seem harmless but misplaced. I asked no questions aloud. My mind raced too quickly for words. I scanned the room again, unable to grasp how unfamiliar it felt. The air didn't even smell the same. The faint citrus scent I always kept in diffusers had been replaced by something powdery and warm, something that didn't connect to any memory I owned. A man stepped into view behind her, his expression guarded but not unfriendly. He carried a box labeled with a moving company's name, and he set it down near a hallway I used to run through as a kid. I felt an ache I couldn't explain. Not anger, not fear, just a deep rupture, as if a seam inside me had been torn open without warning. I forced myself to look away from the furniture and toward the details that mattered. A stack of folders sat on the coffee table, the kind used during closing processes for real estate transactions. Their edges were crisp, organized, freshly handled. Nothing in that stack was mine. I recognized no handwriting. Yet something about the weight of those documents radiated a finality that made my pulse quicken. I stepped back outside, needing air, space, anything to understand the situation without collapsing into it. My eyes drifted to the curb, where a moving truck idled with its back doors open. Inside were more boxes, labeled with children's names I didn't know. A stroller leaned against the wheel, already dusty from the road. This wasn't a temporary visit. These people had settled in. They weren't confused, displaced, or waiting for permission. They believed this was their home. I reached into my bag for my phone, not to call anyone yet, but to anchor myself in the reality of the moment. The security camera feed I checked so often in Seattle flashed through my mind. Static images, no movement, nothing to hint at strangers gradually building a life inside my walls. I opened the app again, though I knew it wouldn't change what I was seeing with my own eyes. The footage hadn't updated in weeks. A connectivity issue I hadn't noticed before had severed the one line of sight I trusted most. As I stood there, the woman stepped out onto the porch, still holding her child. She didn't seem frightened. If anything, she appeared apologetic, as though she sensed the weight of something she hadn't meant to disturb. She glanced back toward the living room, then toward the folders on the table, and I could see in the hesitation of her movements that she believed whatever brought her here was legitimate and complete. A long, quiet realization settled in my chest. She wasn't the one who had crossed a line. She was living out the result of decisions made far from her awareness, decisions that required knowledge only a handful of people owned. Decisions someone close to me had made with confidence, believing distance and silence would hide everything. I took another step back from the porch, absorbing the scene not as a misunderstanding but as a dismantled truth I needed to confront piece by piece. The house I thought I was returning to had already shifted into someone else's story, and I had been replaced without a single warning. It was a fracture I couldn't repair in the doorway. I needed clarity, documents, and a full picture of whatever had taken root during my absence. Standing in the yard under the weight of the Phoenix sun, I realized the ground beneath me had changed long before I arrived to see it. By the time I left the sidewalk and reached my car, the heat had settled deeper into the afternoon, wrapping around me as if the entire city understood something irreversible had happened. I sat behind the wheel for a moment, letting the engine's quiet rumble steady my nerves. The scene inside that house played through my thoughts again. The unfamiliar furniture, the folders, the certainty with which that family occupied every room. None of it left space for doubt. Someone had handed my home over to them, and whoever did it had counted on me being too far away to notice until it was too late. I opened my laptop, using the hotspot on my phone to access anything I could find. The county's online property records loaded slowly, the spinning icon taunting me with seconds that felt longer than they should. When the page finally appeared, the transfer details stared back with cold precision. A sale price of $600,000, a signing date that landed squarely during my assignment in Seattle, and worst of all, a signature displayed beside my printed name, fully accepted, fully processed, fully legal on paper. The shape of the signature was nearly right. Someone had copied the slant, the spacing, even the awkward curl of the Y at the end. But the pressure strokes were wrong, too smooth, too controlled. I had never signed a deed in my life, and even if I had, I wouldn't have done it from another state without speaking to anyone. The reality sat like a stone in my stomach. Whoever forged that signature had confidence, enough to submit it to a title company, enough to work with an agent, enough to close a sale without hesitation. I saved the document, downloaded every file available, and copied each detail twice. Evidence wasn't something I could afford to mishandle. My hands stayed surprisingly steady despite the churn in my chest. Years of project work had trained me to sort information before letting emotion take over, and that discipline guided me now. Owen Hart came to mind next. He had been a family friend long before he became an attorney, someone who offered advice without judgment and handled every legal question with calm practicality. I didn't call him immediately. Instead, I took several minutes reviewing the property transfer again, studying each electronic timestamp and notarization stamp. The notary seal looked real. The filings had passed through the county office without issue. Nothing suggested hesitation from anyone involved. The only false element in the entire sequence was me, my absence, my forged consent, my unknowing role in a transaction I never agreed to. When I finally dialed Owen, I kept my voice level. He answered with his usual steady tone, but when I told him I needed help, it sharpened into focus. I didn't describe the shock, the unfamiliar faces, or the emotional rupture from seeing strangers in my childhood home. I stayed with the facts. A recorded sale under my name, a signature that wasn't mine, a timeline that aligned with my time away, and the appearance of a fully settled family inside the property. He listened without interrupting, and I could almost picture him jotting down notes the way he always did. He asked for scans of everything I had, so I sent them immediately. While the files transferred, I leaned back in the seat and stared through the windshield at the quiet street. Nothing outside reflected what was unraveling behind closed doors and official records. Kids played 3 houses down. A neighbor watered plants. A delivery van rolled past without slowing. My life had shifted into a new trajectory, while the world around me kept following its predictable rhythm. Owen called back quicker than I expected. His voice held the calm of someone who had seen enough legal chaos to recognize the contours of fraud the moment they appeared. He confirmed what I already suspected, but hadn't allowed myself to articulate clearly. The signature carried indicators of imitation, the notarial stamp needed verification, and the authority used to execute the sale raised questions about power of attorney permissions. He didn't speculate about who might have been responsible. He didn't need to. The facts alone pointed toward intentional wrongdoing. He asked if I had given anyone access to documents, financial accounts, or keys while I was gone. The answer should have been simple, but it wasn't. I had kept the house locked, secured, monitored. I had shared nothing except travel updates with Lydia. The thought lingered uncomfortably, never fully formed, but impossible to ignore. I didn't follow it. Not yet. Owen said the first step was pulling the full closing package. The notarized deed, seller's affidavit, proof of identification, wire confirmations, and any written authorization supposedly provided by me. He would request each document formally and begin tracing the transaction from listing to closing. He told me to keep everything I found private for now. No accusations, no confrontations. Evidence first, strategy second, emotion last. I agreed because he was right, and because the weight inside my chest tightened every time I replayed the moment that woman opened my front door. Before ending the call, he said something that stayed with me longer than I expected. Whatever happened here, Jenna, it was deliberate. And whoever did it assumed you wouldn't look closely. The certainty in his tone settled deeper than the Arizona heat. I closed my laptop and sat quietly, understanding now that what waited ahead wouldn't be a misunderstanding to clear up, but a structure built on deception, layer by layer. And every layer would lead me to someone who thought I would stay silent. The next morning carried a quiet coolness that helped me stay grounded as I drove to Owen's office. The building sat tucked between two medical plazas, modest compared to the taller developments nearby, but familiar in a way that steadied me. Stepping inside felt like returning to a place where problems still had order, where someone knew how to untangle knots I could barely describe. Owen greeted me with his usual calm, but his eyes held a seriousness that hadn't been there during our call. He led me into a conference room and spread several printed documents across the table, records he had already pulled overnight. Seeing them laid out in physical form made the situation feel sharper, more deliberate, as if the paper itself carried the weight of decisions made behind my back. I sat down slowly, letting the arrangement of pages speak before Owen said anything. Each document, the deed, the acknowledgement, the closing statement, had my printed name neatly positioned beside the same forged signature that had now appeared in multiple forms. Up close, the imitation looked confident, but confidence was often easiest to fake on paper. Owen handed me a magnified print of the signature comparison he had prepared. He pointed out the subtle breaks in pressure, the unnatural uniformity along the slanted strokes, the hesitation marks near the curve of the J. They were details I wouldn't have noticed on my own, but once he highlighted them, the differences became undeniable. Someone hadn't just attempted a forgery, they had practiced it. He shifted to another document next, a seller's authorization form claiming I had approved the listing weeks before the sale. The date fell during a period when I had barely been able to access reliable Wi-Fi in Seattle, let alone sign a form authorizing a major transaction. The scanned identification attached to the file looked like my driver's license, but the resolution was degraded in a way that obscured the security features. He marked it with a yellow tab, indicating another element requiring verification. Owen explained the sequence of events a legitimate sale should follow, then ran through the sequence captured in the county's records. Several steps didn't align, not improperly completed, but suspiciously streamlined in a way that suggested cooperation between the agent and seller. The property had been listed for only 4 days before an offer was accepted. The inspection occurred unusually fast. The closing was executed within a week, leaving almost no room for delays. Real estate transactions rarely moved that quickly unless someone pushed them aggressively. Then he handed me a sheet that made my jaw tense. The commission payout to Caldwell. It was significantly higher than a typical seller's agent fee. The number was bold, unmistakable, and out of line with normal practice. Owen didn't have to explain why it mattered. A large commission often meant someone was being compensated for something beyond standard work. He continued walking through each document, the wire instructions directing the buyer's payment, the transfer confirmation showing funds landing in an account under Lydia's name, the notarization page with signatures that didn't belong in the same ink family. Every piece added weight to a reality I had hoped would feel less intentional up close. Instead, each detail deepened the clarity of the truth. I asked Owen how someone could move money that quickly. He showed me a printed timeline of the account activity he had accessed through legal channels. The deposit appeared, then dispersed in several transfers across accounts linked to Lydia within a short span. It looked organized, not frantic, not impulsive. She had planned it. The realization tightened something inside my chest that I didn't attempt to soften. He laid out the next steps with methodical precision. We would need statements from the notary, transaction logs from Caldwell's brokerage, and a copy of the original listing agreement. He had already requested most of them. He also wanted me to gather any communication I had exchanged with Lydia during my assignment, especially anything referencing the house. Even messages that seemed harmless could help build a timeline showing she concealed the truth deliberately. After reviewing the documents again, Owen asked if I felt ready to pursue this fully. Not emotionally, legally. This was the point where cases stopped being misunderstandings and became structured claims. I took a breath before answering. The shift had already happened inside me long before this meeting. Seeing the documents confirmed it. There was no room left for uncertainty. Owen then handed me a small list of tasks. I needed to retrieve bank statements from the months before my assignment, secure my identification documents, and change passwords for every account that tied back to personal records. He suggested storing important files offline for now. Whoever forged my signature had enough information to imitate me once. We couldn't assume they wouldn't try again. Before leaving, I looked once more at the forged signature on the deed. A simple curve of ink, confident in appearance but hollow underneath. Someone believed that marking my name without my presence would be enough to erase me from my own home. The audacity of that assumption settled deeper than anger. It left a quiet determination in its wake. Walking out of Owen's office, I stepped into the bright Arizona light with a folder of evidence tucked under my arm. Every document inside pointed toward the same truth. This wasn't a misunderstanding, a mistake, or a careless oversight. It was an engineered act carried out by someone who believed distance meant helplessness. They were wrong. By the time I left Owen's office, the sun had shifted into the late afternoon angle that pressed long shadows across the parking lot. I sat in my car for a few seconds, letting the noise of everything settle, then started the engine with a quiet resolve. Evidence on paper told one story, but I wanted to understand what the people inside my house had been told. Their presence felt too settled, too confident, and understanding their side of the transaction could give me another piece of the timeline Owen needed. I drove back toward my neighborhood, keeping my speed measured, the familiar streets passing in a blur of muted color. When I reached the block, the moving truck from the day before was gone, replaced by two compact cars parked neatly in the driveway I once used every morning. The porch light glowed faintly even though daylight remained, another unfamiliar detail layered on top of changes I hadn't asked for. I approached the house quietly. I didn't step onto the porch or attempt contact. Owen had warned me not to initiate anything that could be interpreted as interference. Instead, I observed from the sidewalk where I could see through the open blinds into the living room. The family moved with a normal rhythm, organizing shelves, folding small clothes, unpacking more boxes. Nothing about them suggested awareness of wrongdoing. Their expressions carried the easy focus of people building a home, not people hiding a secret. I took mental notes of the items they were unpacking, the timeline implied by their progress, and the details that indicated how long they believed they would stay. All of it reinforced a truth I had already accepted. They had purchased the property in good faith. They weren't the enemy. They were another layer in the fallout of someone else's actions, and there was no sense resenting them for occupying a space they thought was legally theirs. I stepped back toward the street and returned to my car, careful not to linger long enough to draw attention. Owen had asked for anything that clarified the buyer's understanding of the sale, and though I couldn't speak to them directly yet, I now had a clearer sense of their role. They weren't hiding anything. They were settling into a life they believed they had paid for. My next stop was Caldwell Realty. The office sat in a commercial complex about 15 minutes away, wedged between a dental practice and a small cafe. The glass-fronted building displayed listing photos in neat rows, each framed with cheerful captions about price reductions and new opportunities. It looked exactly like any other brokerage, which only made the undercurrent of manipulation harder to ignore. I entered the building without hesitation. The receptionist greeted me warmly, unaware of the reason for my visit, and offered a brochure about market trends. I accepted it, though the glossy pages told me nothing I needed to know. The waiting area held a clear view of several desks beyond a frosted half partition. I scanned the nameplates until I located Caldwell's. His desk told a story long before he did. The stacks of papers were arranged too neatly for someone who processed multiple transactions a week. The framed certificates on the wall hung perfectly aligned, but the edges of their frames showed slight discoloration from recent repositioning. A locked drawer beneath the monitor had a keyhole polished from frequent use. Nothing about the station felt organic. It felt curated. I didn't need access to his files. Owen would secure those through formal channels. What I needed was context. How often Caldwell closed deals quickly, whether others in the office interacted with him regularly, whether any staff hesitated when hearing his name. As I observed quietly from the waiting area, an agent passed by and mentioned his absence today, noting he had a few things to straighten out. Her tone carried mild irritation, as though he frequently left others to manage loose ends. I stayed only long enough to gather impressions without raising suspicion. As I walked out, I caught a reflection of the office in the glass door. A calm, professional workspace that masked deeper fractures beneath the surface. Whatever Caldwell had orchestrated, he had done it with practiced subtlety. My final stop was the house again, though from a different angle this time. I parked farther down the street and opened my laptop. I attempted to access the security system, not expecting much after the earlier connectivity failures, but needing to document the malfunction for Owen. The feed remained frozen on a timestamp from weeks ago. The notification log showed multiple connection drops clustered around one period, the same period the sale had taken place. The pattern was too precise to be accidental. Someone had interfered with the system intentionally, ensuring I would see nothing during the window when they needed privacy. I documented every detail: the timestamps, the disconnect sequence, the absence of motion logs. Each piece formed a link in the chain of actions that stripped me of visibility and access. With the day fading into evening, I closed the laptop and leaned back in my seat. The evidence collected across the past several hours formed a picture that no longer wavered. Every new detail strengthened the integrity of what Owen was building. The buyers were uninvolved. The brokerage had irregularities surrounding Caldwell's actions, and the timeline of system failures aligned with the unauthorized sale. The more I uncovered, the clearer the truth became. None of this had happened by accident. It was constructed step by step, carried out by someone who assumed distance and silence would shield them from consequence. The next morning arrived with a muted stillness that made everything feel sharper, as if the air itself anticipated what was coming. I drove to Owen's office early, giving myself time to settle before anything unfolded. He had arranged a formal meeting, a required step before filing multiple civil actions and forwarding the criminal packet to investigators. Lydia and Caldwell had both been notified. Whether either of them understood the full reason for the meeting didn't matter. The truth was waiting inside the documents Owen and I had prepared. I sat in the conference room again, though the atmosphere felt nothing like the calm of earlier visits. The table now held organized binders of evidence, each tabbed with precision. Owen reviewed a final list of points he intended to present. His tone remained steady, practical as always, but I saw the underlying seriousness in the tight line of his posture. A knock at the door broke the quiet. Lydia entered first. She looked composed, almost polished, as if she intended to project control before the conversation even began. Her eyes flicked to the binders, then to me, though she avoided holding my gaze for more than a second. Caldwell followed behind her, wearing a neutrality that felt carefully assembled. The receptionist closed the door behind them. Owen began the meeting without preamble. He outlined the agenda, his words efficient and factual. The room carried the sterile quiet of fluorescent lights and unspoken tension. Lydia crossed her arms as he spoke. Caldwell sat with his back straight, hands folded in a posture that suggested experience with disputes, but not necessarily exposure to this level of scrutiny. Owen opened the first binder and placed the forged deed on the table. He didn't dramatize the moment. He simply pointed to the signature and explained, in measured legal language, the findings from a handwriting expert. Then he presented the timeline of my documented location in Seattle during the supposed signing and the notarial violations flagged in the closing package. Lydia didn't react at first. She kept her gaze fixed on the pages without reading them. The stillness around her seemed less like calm and more like calculation. Caldwell, however, shifted in his seat when Owen pointed out the unreported commission increase, the accelerated listing timeline, and the discrepancies in the seller's authorization file. Owen moved through the evidence with quiet precision. He presented communication logs showing I had not authorized any transaction. He displayed property records showing the sale was processed abnormally fast. He highlighted security camera disconnection patterns that aligned with the listing period. Each point layered neatly onto the last. When he finished the sequence, he placed one more sheet at the center of the table, the bank transfer displaying the full proceeds deposited into Lydia's account. The number sat in bold print, undeniable. Silence coated the room. Lydia's composure cracked for the first time. Her eyes darted toward Caldwell with unmistakable blame, but he remained still, maintaining his carefully constructed neutrality. I didn't speak. This wasn't the moment for emotion or memory. Owen continued with the same professional clarity he had used from the beginning. He explained the civil claims we intended to file: fraud, conversion, unjust enrichment, and damages tied to the illegal transfer of property. Then he outlined the criminal referrals: forgery, wire fraud, and real estate transaction misconduct, each carrying penalties that could not be negotiated away without restitution and cooperation. Caldwell acted first. His neutrality dissolved under the weight of the evidence. His posture collapsed slightly, and for the first time he looked directly at the forged deed. He asked no questions. He offered no excuses. His silence told its own story. He recognized the scale of the situation. Lydia's reaction unfolded more slowly. She straightened her shoulders, inhaled, and attempted to steady herself. But the steady cadence she tried to project faltered each time she looked at her own name on the transfer documents. She wasn't simply adjacent to the wrongdoing. She was its direct beneficiary. That fact hung in the air with unmistakable finality. Owen outlined the options available. Restitution was mandatory. Cooperation was required. Any refusal would accelerate both civil and criminal filings. The consequences were not abstract. They were immediate and legally grounded. Lydia finally spoke, but her voice held none of the confidence she often projected. Her words emerged clipped, almost mechanical. She didn't attempt denial. She didn't claim misunderstanding. She focused on minimizing her intent, but intent no longer mattered. The paperwork on the table carried more weight than any explanation she could offer. Caldwell asked for permission to step outside and make a call. Owen allowed it but noted the time. When Caldwell returned, his expression had shifted again. He spoke quietly, acknowledging procedural violations in the way he processed the sale. He didn't confess to forging anything, but he admitted the listing timeline and commission were irregular. His words weren't emotional, they were strategic. He understood cooperation was the only path that preserved any portion of his future in the industry. Owen recorded each acknowledgement, noting them as part of the meeting minutes. Lydia's silence grew heavier with each passing minute. She seemed to shrink into her chair, as if withdrawing could undo the evidence. But nothing she did could erase the ink on the documents. The meeting ended with clear directives. Owen presented formal papers requiring Lydia to return all remaining funds immediately. Additional financial disclosures were required. Caldwell was ordered to provide his complete transaction file and cooperate with investigators. Failure from either party would trigger immediate legal action. As Lydia gathered her belongings, she avoided looking at me. Not out of shame, out of something more brittle, something like disbelief that the situation had progressed into a realm she could no longer control. She left the room first. Caldwell followed after a quiet nod to Owen. When the door closed, the quiet returned, but it felt different now, less suffocating, more resolved. Owen gathered the binders with practiced movements. Every step had followed the legal structure precisely. Nothing had been rushed, nothing exaggerated. The meeting had simply brought the truth into a room where it could no longer be manipulated. As I stepped outside into the sunlight, the clarity of the outcome settled deeply. Lydia's choices had crossed a boundary that couldn't be reversed. There was no path back to what our relationship once was. Not after this. Not ever. The process would continue: paperwork, filings, restitution, consequences, but the emotional part had already reached its end. I didn't feel triumph or vindication. I felt something quieter, heavier, and more final. Distance wasn't created in that meeting. It had only been acknowledged. And I walked away without looking back.